The city of Charlottesville, Virginia, like many cities across the South, is now trying to figure out the answer to one question. What do you do with all the statues we have in town that celebrate the United States Confederacy and its leaders? We will explore that conversation and that question coming up. I'm Coy Barefoot. Let's get started right now.
This conversation today will not be one in which we begin yelling at each other, nor doing different things to disrespect each other.
In the last few days, the issue behind removing the Robert E. Lee Monument has grown tremendously. City Council members Wes Bellamy and Kristen Sakos fully support the idea of removing the statue as well as renaming Lee Park.
History that we honor through statues and memorials needs to be a history that speaks for what we believe in. And in this case, these statues don't.
We unify this country.
Some say removing the statue is removing history, but Charlottesville's vice mayor feels differently.
Charlottesville is a city that has a great deal of history. Charlottesville is also a city that is moving forward. And as we move forward, in my position, civil rights, as well as the opportunity to make everyone feel included, trumps history.
Governor Terry McAuliffe vetoed a bill that would have stopped local governments from removing Confederate monuments, leaving the decision to remove them up to City Council.
You know, this is a period at which we really have an option to make this decision. State law is now clearer than it had been, and so, you know, people have really been calling on us, you know, to make a decision.
On Monday, Mayor Mike Signer sent out a press release saying we should create a blue ribbon commission on Confederate memorials that will fully explain the policy behind the efforts to remove the Robert E. Lee statue, as well as assessing the cost.
My guest is Phyllis Leffler. She is the director of the Institute for Public History at the University of Virginia and a former professor in the Corcoran Department of History at UVA. Her most recent book is Black Leaders on Leadership, Conversations with Julian Bond. Phyllis, welcome to the program. I'm so glad you're here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about what we just saw. This conversation, this debate, some would say this controversy that has been sparked here in Charlottesville by the fact that two members of City Council have now come forward publicly and said they want to see these Confederate monuments taken down. This statue for Robert E. Lee specifically in Lee Park in downtown Charlottesville. What crosses your mind when we look at this dynamic in this conversation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I was there, so I actually witnessed what went on there. But what I saw there was the degree to which we are a people with divided narratives about our history. Nationally, I think there is enormous distress and an unwillingness to really think more seriously about these competing narratives that define our nation as a people. And I saw that, and I saw, you can just sort of think about the images that you see. You see Confederate flags, you see monuments, you see signs that say Black Lives Matter. Those have become symptomatic in some ways or characteristic of these competing narratives. And we are not unique in Charlottesville. That's the other thing I would say. This is happening all over the country.
Yeah, and certainly across the South, where we've seen, you know, some statues have been taken down in some places in the South.
And there are also competing narratives about these very things in the North as well. It's not unique to the South. And it's not unique to the United States. There are competing narratives abroad too. So this issue is not a single issue at a moment in time. It is an ongoing issue about how we remember and what we do about these remembrances.
Right. And so what would you say to somebody who says, well, Phyllis, you just don't understand. There's no competing narrative. There's just the narrative. There's the truth. And Robert E. Lee was a great man, an honorable man, and people just don't understand his character They don't understand that the South wasn't really fighting about slavery, it was fighting about states' rights, and that the Confederate flag is not about racism or the Confederacy so much as it's about heritage and family and memory.
Well, I would say that there are certain elements in our past that as Americans we should not be proud of. I would say that there is both bad history and also bad commemoration of history. Now, I know what I'm just saying seems very, very stark, so I want to soften that just a little by saying that I think we need to try to understand one another in terms of where these competing narratives come from. And I think this perhaps is a moment in time when we might advocate for doing just that, for trying to have conversations and trying to grow as a result of these conversations.
Right. Now, this conversation didn't catch you by surprise because you were engaged in a group that was exploring just this statue, just this park, and just these ideas before it even made the news. And I should say, you know, you and I have both been around this little town for a long time. I've been here almost 30 years, and I certainly have heard this conversation before. I wrote about it in the Seville Weekly back in the 90s. I remember as a young reporter writing about this debate that was raging in town, and it seems to ebb and flow. Have we reached a point, you think, where there's a critical mass of people who really want to do something about this?
Yes, I think there is a critical mass of people that wants to do something about it, and I think this conversation will keep being spawned and addressed because we're not unique, as I said earlier, because it's a conversation that's going on in many, many places simultaneously.
Right.
But you know, I've studied this for about 30 years. I've been teaching the field of public history, and I've been exploring what some of these larger issues are in other communities. I have followed some of the controversies, not just about Civil War statues, but about controversies wherever. You know, how do we commemorate tragedy? How do we commemorate loss? How do we commemorate trauma in this country? What kinds of decisions have to be made in order to feel that everybody's point of view is heard, especially new traumas, for example, that we've suffered? Like if you're putting up a memorial to a bombing, such as in Oklahoma City, what kind of a memorial should you have? And who gets represented? And who are the victims? So these kinds of issues, again, are discussed over and over again. They're discussed in our nation's museums. They're discussed in historic parks. They're discussed on battlefields. You know, these are ongoing issues of public history.
So, and you've seen these conversations happen before. I'm reminded of something I heard recently from somebody who said to me, imagine if you were a Jew walking in Germany and you passed a statue to Adolf Hitler that the Germans had insisted stay up after the war. Would that make you uncomfortable? And I was like, of course it would make me uncomfortable. I would be outraged that it was still standing.
Yes, well, I totally agree with that. And, you know, I know personally how uncomfortable I would be walking across or finding such a statue. And I am incredibly impressed by what's happened, for example, in a place like Berlin, where there's all kinds of memorials in multiple forms to the victims of the Holocaust. You know, and, you know, obviously, there are certain parallels in terms of who the victims are about various things in our own country, but we don't have those kinds of memorials here. But, you know, to go back to your comment about a statue of Hitler, I agree, that would be extremely offensive. And I think we must be sensitive. We have to be sensitive to the people who would find statues of Lee or Jefferson Davis equally offensive. And of course, those of us who abhor the idea of slavery and our history of slavery are somewhat appalled by these statues. Maybe they don't really affect me in as deeply personal a way as they do an African American who might still be enslaved had the war gone in a different direction. Yeah. So I understand the concern, and I'm very empathetic to the concern and to the sense of anger and discomfort that people feel. Much as I would be equally uncomfortable if I had to pass by a statue of Hitler as a Jewish woman, but so I think it's a very thorny problem. I don't think it's
it really
a problem.
is, isn't it? I mean, there's
I
no
don't
quick
think it's a problem with
solution.
an easy
There's no
solution.
quick answer to this.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But you know, I was just doing a little bit of research on this issue, and I learned that in 2013, a statue of Hitler was put up inside the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, inside, you know, the place that commemorates the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was a statue that was created by an Italian sculptor. It's a statue of a very young boy in school in a sort of prayerful mode, kneeling in prayer. As you can imagine, when this statue went into this commemorative space for the Warsaw Ghetto, people were appalled, you know. And
it's supposed to be Hitler as a young boy?
It's supposed to be Hitler as a young boy. The statue is just called him. You only see him from the rear, and you can only see him through the fence of the Warsaw Ghetto, through the fence that's been put up. So you only see the back of him. It's been called him. The chief rabbi of Poland approved this statue, but of course it just caused incredible consternation. So why is it there? Why would you do this in 2011 or 13 or whatever it was? And you know, this artist claimed, and the people who bought into it claimed, that this was a way of recognizing that we don't always understand evil until it's more fully developed. And that evil can also come in the guise of a very young child in prayer. And that we need to confront that about our societies.
Yeah.
So there it is, it stands there. And so I'm thinking, can we figure out ways in Charlottesville to really make our commemorative statues more complex? You know, is there a way to leave Robert E. Lee in place and have other statues in conversation with him? Is there a way to provoke that conversation so that we have counterpoints to the glorified narrative?
To the veneration of the Confederate leaders and change it. You know, I have said publicly, and I agree with you, and I've said publicly that I think the folks who want to take it down or destroy it have history on their side, and they're coming from the right place. But I also don't support removing the statue and putting it in a museum because there's so many of us, there's such a great sector of the population who won't step foot in that museum, and we all know it. And why is it that that museum experience, that rich context that can really invite people to explore these competing narratives, why must that only be in a museum? Why can't that be in a public park? And I would even say, why shouldn't it be in a public park? And you can do that through, I mean, there's any number of creative ways to do that publicly. And you in your career, you've studied ways in public history that people have done this successfully.
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is to think about some of the work of designers and artists, the use of video equipment, for example, to reflect images onto statues that give us other examples of
Adds a whole nother layer,
of
literally.
faces.
Yeah.
Right, so that you layer history and you demonstrate that indeed there are multiple narratives and that single statue is not the sole story, you know. So, you know, I would love it if we in our cities and communities across America could take that kind of a creative approach and say, let's think about the exciting things that we could do, not to sanitize the past, not to remove it, not to say this is problematic, so we're not going to confront it, we're not going to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable.
We don't want to offend people.
Right.
God forbid. Right.
We don't want to offend people. I don't want to offend people either, you know, but I'm not sure that that's going to solve the multiple problems that came on the backs of this problematic history. I mean, I think we can only begin to solve the larger socioeconomic problems, problems of housing, problems of health care that still exist, if we are truly willing to confront this past. And we aren't willing to confront it. We want to commemorate it and memorialize it and glorify it, or on the other hand, get rid of it. And that's not confronting it.
And that glorifying and that veneration and the whole lost cause myth is still very much a way of sanitizing and covering up and keeping us as this mythic wall between us and the realities of the past.
For sure.
The true horrors, the daily horror of human slavery, even right here in Charlottesville.
Well, that's absolutely true. And what's interesting about these statues that we're now talking about is that these statues didn't get created in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. They didn't get created until the 1920s or the 19-teens. And of course, they were created in the aftermath of Reconstruction in order to try to glorify, in a nostalgic sense, this great past that supposedly had been lost. So, you know, it's the very time that all the Jim Crow legislation begins to be put in place. It's the same time as the Racial Integrity Acts are passed. It's the same time as the Klan is formed in Charlottesville. So these are not statues to the Civil War that we are really remembering. They're really statues to the Lost Cause and to the Jim Crow era, and trying to glorify, you know, and justify
white supremacy.
That era, of course, with white supremacy.
And a lot of people, Phyllis, they don't know that. I mean,
no, they don't know
they
that.
really don't know
They
that.
don't
Even
know
the people
that.
out there waving the Confederate flags, they don't know that these statues did not go up in the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s. It was the 1920s.
Right.
By the time you start seeing these kind of statues go up in the public square.
So it is problematic. I'm not saying that it's not problematic, but the question is, what do we do about it now? And I don't know if the answer is to take a statue that's been in place for 100 years and just remove it. I mean, I think we should have a public conversation, a series of dialogues and conversations, and maybe a competition. Maybe we should have a citywide or statewide competition.
Or international
competition.
I mean, Charlottesville has an opportunity really here to show the nation how the South can come to terms with these competing narratives, with the lost cause myth.
That's exactly right. I would love to see that happen. You know, we have this great project in place called Art in Place.
Right.
You know, maybe this is not possible, but I would love to see us turn the competition of Art in Place into various ways to take our city, all through the city, and use it as a way to confront this issue. You know, what kind of art pieces could we come up with? What kinds of installations might we come up with? So wherever people went in the city, they needed to think about the larger history, the deeper history that surrounds us.
And one way we can do that, I was in conversation yesterday with my friend Eugene Williams, who is a civil rights pioneer and leader here in Charlottesville, right on the very front line of the civil rights movement in our neighborhoods. And we were talking about this subject, and we were commiserating that, you know, where are the statues?
Right.
Where are the monuments to those leaders in that time in our town? They're not here. Where are they? You know, there are some across the South. Give communities credit. They do exist. But there seems to almost be this knee-jerk reaction, well, we'll put up another Martin Luther King statue or another Martin Luther King Boulevard, or when the South is full of leaders, courageous men and women who were on the front line of the civil rights movement in their own neighborhoods. And there's nothing to remember them.
And they really need to be remembered, because, you know, you can go from the Civil War to the present day, but what about all that's in between? You know, how do we remember those years that are in between? You know, and that very fact of honoring history where it took place, it would be so valuable. You know, people do point out that neither Lee nor Stonewall Jackson actually fought in Charlottesville, and yet we have these statues to them here in Charlottesville, you know. So, I mean, who are the people who fought in Charlottesville who we might like to remember, you know, on you know, who really did make a difference in terms of the well-being of this city, and fought, I don't just mean fought in battles, I mean fought issues.
And it hasn't been discussed publicly, but you and I have discussed that there is another Confederate statue on the grounds at the University of Virginia. It's in a cemetery, which puts a different spin on it, doesn't it? It's not a public park, even though it's state land, I guess. It's on grounds at UVA, but it marks the burial site of many Confederate soldiers who died at the Charlottesville UVA General Hospital during the Civil War.
Right. Yeah, and the cemetery there, the Confederate cemetery that's right outside the main cemetery, feels very much like it's a university space. I mean, it is on the grounds of the university, so it represents the university. And we all know that the University of Virginia is exploring this very issue and working on the notion of having a memorial to enslaved labor.
Right, right.
You know, so that's a kind of counter narrative that, if that ever happens, might be a really valuable thing.
And that's a really, take a moment to reflect on that, because that's, I think you and I both agree that that's an overdue and much welcome conversation at the University of Virginia and at universities around the country, North and South, who are dealing with their relationships to human slavery.
And virtually every university in America was built on the back of slaves, North and South. You know, there's a very famous book by Craig Wilder that lays all of that out. It's really powerful reading to think. I mean, you know, there were not just slave owners who built universities in the South, but ship owners and slavers, you know, in the northern universities. This all started at Brown University, of course, when President Ruth Simmons opened that discussion. She was the first African-American president of a major Ivy League university. Well, you know, it takes that kind of sensitivity and understanding to start those conversations. So I'm glad this conversation has been provoked in Charlottesville. I really think it is time. And I don't think, frankly, that the University of Virginia would have taken it on unless there was also that pressure that came over many, many years to do so. And, you know, I was for a long time a part of this organization called UCARE, the University Community Action for Racial Equity.
Absolutely.
That Frank Dukes and John Alexander got started. I was there from the beginning. I think those conversations that were held between the community and the university and students and faculty and community members, I think that finally provoked the university into taking this more seriously. So it does take somebody who's going to stand up and say we need to think about changing our narrative.
Right, right.
So again, I welcome the fact that this has happened, but I'd like us to go about it in a way that we will all grow as a result of tackling it.
Right. So where should we leave this? We only have a couple minutes left, but what should the mayor of Charlottesville has called for a blue ribbon commission to put people in a room to have this conversation. What should we do with these statues? Do we leave them there? Do we not do anything? Do we destroy them? Do we put them in a museum? Do we embrace the idea, as you and I would advocate, embrace the idea of putting that museum experience actually in the park and have, you know, richer signage and a richer visitor experience so that when you see this statue, you aren't moved to celebrate the Confederacy so much as you are invited into exploring what is a very complicated story about the past.
Yeah, well, you know, I was involved in this conversation for very many months before Wes Bellamy even provoked it. A friend, Ann McKeithen, called me. She looks out at the Lee statue. She said she was concerned about it. And we pulled a small group together to start to have this conversation, and then Wes came out with his...
You were the commission before there was a commission.
So we're all for having that conversation, to sit down with sober minds, try to think through what it is we really want to represent and how we want to deal with it. But most importantly, I would say what needs to come out of this is that in some way we need to recognize that there isn't a single narrative, and it's not a narrative in any case, you know, of glorification of conquest. That is not what I want the narrative to be.
Right.
But I want us to think about it thoughtfully, and you know, and to figure out, again, as you said, I totally agree. How can we be leaders? How can we be
seize this historic opportunity?
Leaders.
Absolutely.
And we have a lot of creative minds in Charlottesville. I think we can do really good work.
Good stuff. Phyllis, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Phyllis Leffler is the director of the Institute for Public History at the University of Virginia, and her most recent book is Black Leaders on Leadership, Conversations with Julian Bond. I'm Coy Barefoot. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Hi, I'm Coy Barefoot, and I'm here on the lawn at the University of Virginia. You know, nobody has a better seat for the UVA graduation ceremonies than Homer and his guide. Let me tell you about this beautiful piece of artwork and one of the most iconic statues at the University of Virginia. Homer and his guide were sculpted by artist Moses Ezekiel, who is a native of Richmond and was the first Jewish cadet to graduate from the Virginia Military Institute. He was also one of a few dozen cadets who hiked up and participated in the Battle of Newmarket, where many died and where Moses Ezekiel was injured. During the Civil War, Moses Ezekiel was stationed in Richmond, where he helped to train new Confederate cadets entering the Confederate Army, and he later fought in the trenches defending the Confederate capital of Richmond. After the Civil War, he traveled to Europe, studied sculpture, and became one of the world's most famous artists. Homer and his guide, as the sculpture is known, was officially unveiled at the University of Virginia on Monday evening, June 10th, 1907. The 5 o'clock ceremony was actually held in Old Cabell Hall, where there were numerous speeches honoring the artist who was then living in Rome and the life of Homer. And it was held inside because there was a downpour that night, and all of the folks came out here and stood in the rain just long enough to unveil this beautiful statue, which President Alderman said would sit here on the lawn forever. 3 years later, almost to the day, the University of Virginia accepted a second gift from artist Moses Ezekiel, this replica of his Jefferson statue, the original of which was made in 1901 and was a gift to the city of Louisville, Kentucky. But Ezekiel presented this Jefferson depicted atop the Liberty Bell to the University of Virginia, and it was officially dedicated on Wednesday morning, June 15th, 1910, during the commencement exercises. After the graduation ceremonies in Old Cabell Hall that morning, the guests and the graduating students assembled here in a big circle around the new statue and celebrated its unveiling here in a newly landscaped plaza on the north side of the UVA Rotunda. Well, that does it for today. You've been watching the Coy Barefoot program. Don't forget to join me next week. We'll talk with eminent, noted Civil War historian Gary Gallagher will be on the program. You can find me online at coybarefoot.com, and you can learn more about the Center for Media and Citizenship at mediaandcitizenship.org. Y'all have a great week, and be good to each other.